Welcome. This is part one of a two-part tutorial on how to win with the Saxony faction in Scythe. I was able to live stream this tutorial recently with JoyDivision, and this video is the first half of the tutorial and deals with strategies specific to Saxony. In part two, which will be in a follow-up video, we talk about the individual player mats and how to play each one. Please enjoy. Thank you. He's great Saxony player, loves the faction, and in my opinion has done as much or more than anyone else to affect or revolutionize the way Saxony is played in sort of the meta in online competitive Scythe. And if you can't tell, I'm fighting a cold here, so I guess just try to enjoy my low rumbly voice because I can't do very much about it right now. Wasn't the plan, but here we are. So Joy, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I think your voice sounds great, so I was about to comment like you've really got it down. Sorry about the cold, though. Yeah, happy to be here and excited to talk about Saxony.
Yeah, so my thought here, kind of my goal, is that we're going to start at the beginning and just start with the basics. Saxony, faction ability, what makes it unique, and kind of work our way towards sort of more complex strategies as we go along, and then wrap up with some discussion about openings for the different mats and kind of take questions along the way. So that's what I have in mind, and I'm really excited about it. So I know before from table talks you've done with the Daily Scythe and from talking with you that Saxony is actually your favorite faction in this game. What would you say makes it your favorite faction?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I really didn't like them when I first learned the game. I started playing. You think they would be fun because they start with some metal, they've got a village, they've got like a cool theme going. I just really liked them aesthetically, but when I was playing them, I kind of struggled to have success until I honed in on their faction abilities. So dominate and then their mech abilities really give you a super unique play style available that does require some more experience to fully utilize. So I think it was a rough learning curve in the beginning, but they grew to be my favorite faction by far.
And really quickly, most viewers are probably familiar with this, but dominate is you can get unlimited combat stars and you can place, it says unlimited objectives, but really you only get two in so you can place two objectives and unlimited combat stars is dominate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and every faction in the base game, so the 5, they have 2 mechs that are unique to just them because everyone has a river walk and everyone has speed, but then you have like 2 other ones. So I consider those to be part of that like faction specific play style. So dominate, you have different stars available to you, and then the special mechs would be underpass and disarm.
Right. So I think that dominate is one of the more underrated faction abilities. And the reason I say that is because even though a lot of the faction abilities can be very powerful, coercion gets a lot of credit for that. Relentless with Rusviet gets a lot of credit for that. Dominate can really almost replace a vibrant economy, which I think makes it kind of unique among the faction abilities. What do you feel like are the strengths of dominate, and how does it change Saxony gameplay?
Yeah, I mean, it completely changes what you're able to do. And just to illustrate that, I think I'm going to pull my stars over towards the star track at the top. Right here, right, these are all the ones available to you. Every faction in the game, pretty much, like at high level, will do the same 4 stars every single game. So if they're available to you, you'll take your objective, your 2 combats, and your worker star. The other 2 are kind of up to you where they go, but it's almost always going to be these 2, right? So if you're not Saxony, this is almost always what your board looks like when you win the game. There's exceptions, of course, but it's pretty straightforward and pretty like streamlined. Now, if you are Saxony, what if I told you you could put this star wherever you wanted, including over here or over here. Right? It completely changes openings that you could do, positions you could take, and the best part about all of this is your opponent has no idea where your stars are going to come from. Like, they don't know if you have 2, 1, or 0 objectives, and they don't know how many combats you're actually trying to win versus set up for your advantage later on. So you have way more flexibility with where those stars can be placed off of just your faction ability alone, and that's just not something any other faction has available to them.
And
hopefully that's helpful.
One of the significances of that, right, is that enlist is probably is 4 turns right there. That enlist star minimum, not to mention the time it takes to set up the economy that produces the food. It gives you those turns, whereas a combat or an objective could add 0 to 1 turns to your overall game. So Saxony, I mean, they have the ability, right, with just about any mat to end the game very quickly.
Right. Yeah, and it opens up a lot of, you can do things 1 or 2 times that are high value and not be committed to doing it 4 times. Like, you don't have to build 4 buildings if you just need like 1 or 2, because you're able to put stars at places. Same with enlist or even mechs. So typically you want all of your mechs just because they're so good and very fun to play with.
Right. So with Saxony, I feel like typically the stars that people go for, they go for this mech star. There are some super rush games I've seen where people get 2 objectives and they get a bunch of combats and they don't even get more than 2 mechs. But more times than not, what I tend to see is the worker star, the mech star, and then these last 4 stars go either objective, objective, combat, 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 objective, or as a friend of ours likes to call it, the 4 combat objective, where you don't even get an objective at all because what you were dealt was no good.
Yeah, that's kind of the worst case scenario, but it's still, you always have a way out because Dominate has no cap on combat victories.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, for players newer to Saxony, it can be kind of game changing to think in terms of Saxony being able to just skip the economic model that is so common in Scythe. And despite the fact that newer players are learning that enlist is one of the most overpowered bottom row actions in the game, Saxony faction ability is really so strong they can get away without it. Sometimes getting 1 list, like the coin enlist or the combat card enlist, can be huge. What do you think about when you say you get 1 enlist because you got food on an encounter? How do you decide? I mostly see people go for the coin enlist or the combat card enlist. How do you decide which one of those to go for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a really important decision you will make because it usually happens right here on, let's see, I don't know, turn 3, turn 5. So it's pretty early in the game. You get this first encounter, and you have the opportunity to enlist because we know there's no food where you start, so probably not going to get there any meaningful time any other way. When you get this enlist, you should already know what stars you're going to get if everything goes your way. So you should already have a plan. Here's what my 6 stars are going to be. And
you can,
depending on how many...
A big part of making that plan is having already seen your objectives at this point, right?
Yeah, from turn 0, you got to start thinking about how it's going to go. And yes, objectives, and then the cards you got, like combat cards you received, are a big part of that. And then the matchups. So who are your opponents, and where are they? Like what mats and factions are you up against? Those all impact what enlist you would take, because I can go into more detail about like why you would pick coin versus card, but in general, which one is going to have the best? Which one is going to point you furthest towards your end goal, your win condition? Because if it was possible, you would just take both. They're both really good, but sometimes you have you need a lot of cards to finish the game, and you don't have a 5 yet. Or other times, like maybe Get Rich or Trying is pretty likely if you do take that coin list on turn 3, because if you add like add 12 to what you thought you were going to get, and that turns into a star, it's definitely worth it, right?
Right.
So it's a long answer, but it is complicated. It's just also like a really important decision, and the enlist is one of the best things you could find that early for Saxony.
I like what you said about matchups. And I'm going to go down to this board down here, the industrial board, really quickly. One of the things I think of when I think matchups, and I want you to tell me what you think about this and then add to it if you have some thoughts, is one of the things I look for is on my opponent's matchups where the bolster action is. For instance, if I go to state, engineering, let's see if I can find the mat I'm looking for, because they're not.
Oh, you're looking for a different one?
Yeah, I'm looking for mechanical.
Oh, okay. Yeah, mechanical. Right. So where's their bolster action?
Right. We've got this mechanical, the bolster's over deploy. So if I see the mechanical mat, I know there's a good chance that my opponent is going to have quite a bit of power. And then I also have to think about their mech abilities. So mechanical Albion is a weak combination, but it might be difficult to get combats off them because if they're bolstering a lot and they have shields, so they're getting 2 more power every time I attack them, it might be difficult for me to wear them down, right?
Right.
So
yeah, I mean,
that's one thing I look for is the where bolster is on the mat, and if it's over a bottom row action that my opponents are likely to employ. What are some other things to look for in the matchups?
Yeah, so what you just said has a really big impact on the combat, like handling combats, and that's going to be a huge topic with Saxony. Is how do you approach getting those combat stars, and what, like, how much resource should you commit to each fight? So that'll definitely come back later. The thing I look for the most is what stars will my opponents get, and you kind of alluded to that too. Is what bottom row actions are my opponents going to do? Like sometimes, this is rare, but sometimes the upgrade enlist, right? So getting that power bonus, sometimes the correct choice if you're about to see like 5 to 6 power from your neighbors through upgrades. And you can know this based on the boards that they have and the moves that they've done so far. So
you might see that with the patriotic board. Another one you might see with the patriotic board has move over upgrade. So especially IFA that moves a lot might go for the upgrade star or get multiple upgrades. Another one, and I don't have memorized of which states represent which boards, but the engineering board, where it's you get quite a bit of coin for going for a lot of upgrades. So it's pretty, I feel like it's pretty common that I see, this is weird, why are all the workers here? Oh no. I feel like
it's all good.
It's pretty common that you see quite a few upgrades when someone has the engineering board, like with Rusviet or Nordic. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and beyond just like what board do they have, is what moves have they taken? Like if someone's trading for a specific resource on the table, they're going to use it. So even if they have, you know, something you wouldn't expect for like a popular action, like let's say, I don't know, like agricultural is a pretty common example. They could go with what their board wants them to do, or they could go with what's going to be competitive. And you have to just like have a lot of awareness, and just like you make your own game plan at the beginning of the game, what stars you're going to get, you want to go through that process for all of your opponents to make some general assumptions. And once you have those, you can recheck every few turns, but specifically after a player moves. Like, what does that movement tell you about what they're probably going to do later in the game?
Yeah, and I wanted to talk with you, this is a good segue, about something you mentioned earlier, and that is the 2 mechs that are unique to Saxony. That's Underpass and Disarm. And you talk about movement and positioning, which I think separates a decent Saxony player from a great Saxony player. So I want to hear some of your thoughts on movement, positioning, and how you can take advantage of underpass and disarm while moving and positioning your units.
Sure, yeah. So the point at which Saxony became my favorite faction to one that I dreaded playing or drawing when we'd set up the board at home was when I realized just how good underpass was. So a typical trend is you get to this position here. You have 3 to 5 workers on the table on these tiles, and we're looking at the village and the starting base iron there. And then you make 2 mechs. Now, most new players, including myself, like this is how I thought about the game when I first started, is you would make speed and riverwalk. Because, like, wow, this is another encounter right there, right in front of me. And also, lumber seems like it's kind of useful, so I'll do that. But what you should do, and what I think unanimously do as Saxony on any combo, is you get underpass. And the reason you get underpass is it turns this starting tile right next to your base into a tunnel access point. So now you can travel to any tunnel, any of these red squares in the center of the board. And that's huge because it gives you access to not only like pretty much all of the points your opponents would try to access the middle of the board, but the factory, more encounters, combat potential. The options are so much larger with underpass than riverwalk. And you should start to think of your home base as being these 3 tiles at home and every single tunnel on the board. Because really, no matter where you are, like even if all your units are at home, you can reach any single tunnel as long as you have underpass. So it's definitely game changing for them.
Right. I mean that makes a lot of sense. And I think that one thing to mention that newer players sometimes miss, because quite honestly, I don't think the tooltip in that's on the mat is very clear. There is a note in the rule book that clarifies this. It's easy to miss. Move between any mountain you control and any tunnel. Obviously, if you're on the mountain, you control it. If there's a worker or a mech already on the mountain, you control it. And you can move back and forth from a controlled mountain to a tunnel. You can also move, as a lot of players do know, from a controlled mountain to a controlled mountain. And
right.
That's something that I played this game for a while before I knew that. So I wanted to throw that out there for anyone who might not know it.
And that's one of the coolest feelings, because it sets up like so many cool positions you can take and moves you can make. It's Saxony, in my opinion, is the most mobile faction in the game through that kind of nuance in underpass, where you can also move from iron to iron, not just tunnels. And this leads to like my favorite Saxony opening, and one that I think like I helped popularize, is that you get your second mech and then you move like this. So you take one of your mechs and all of your workers, grab the character there, to this space on your first move, and then you continue to the tunnel. Now you're on a village tunnel instead of your home base. Why is that good? Underpass works from a tunnel, so you have more movement options than if you were at home. But you can also take this guy, put him on his iron, and like you said, your character can now go from iron to iron. And that is crazy, right? You just went from a village, not even a tunnel space, a village at home, all the way out here to Gao's home. And that's insane mobility. Not only that, but because you are starting your next move on this iron space, through speed, your first move can be to any single tunnel on the board. And that just provides like a lot of freedom.
And you would probably take these 2 workers to the metal as well, because you only need these 3 workers here to get to the...
Yeah, I'm not trying to go for 10 workers, yeah. But this is like an ideal setup, because...
And as you were mentioning before I interrupted you, the next move could be something like this, and then the character can go mountain to mountain for one space and then to the factory. So not only does it set you up pretty nicely and put you on the tunnels, but it segues you to the factory, and because you have underpass, this mountain and this tunnel both function like you're on a tunnel.
Right.
So
So a lot of
I was
go
never
for it.
a great chess player, but I dabbled. And one of the things I did learn about chess is you can think in terms of trying to see ahead a certain number of moves. What's my opponent going to do? You can also think of the board as sort of a positioning game, and how do you take a superior position, and good position can open up opportunities. And in Scythe, I don't know how good I am at looking forward a long way at what my opponent's going to be doing, but one thing I really try to do is think in terms of what sort of spots for my workers and my mechs is going to put me in a good position and hopefully open up opportunities. And this is something I think you're really good at, is positioning your units in such a way that you're going to have opportunity down the road. So what sort of spots do you look at on the board and say, you know, I like to have my units here. I like to try to control these spots. The tunnels are some of them, I would imagine. But like, which tunnels, what spots other than tunnels, what would you say there?
Yeah. So to just keep it high level, I think that it's incredibly important every single time your opponent does a move action, you stop what you're doing and look at how they're moving, because they're going to be stuck there for 2 turns, right? They can't move the next turn unless it's Rusviet. So you have 2 rounds to interact with them, or to force them to take a different action on their next move. And identifying where they're trying to go and what you can take away from them or entice them to do is going to impact your decisions. So again, keeping it general, like, you want people to end their movements on tunnels because you can reach a tunnel from anywhere. And you also have powerful mechs such as Disarm, to where it's advantageous for you to have interactions on those tunnel spaces. So it's much better to force your opponents to move to tunnels than it is to allow them to, move through one. Does that make sense? So
Sure.
I would love my opponent to end their action on a tunnel, and rather than like use it and get out. So one way you can ensure that happens is you start to place your workers just one at a time on those tunnel spaces, because if the opponent hits your worker, they are done moving and they have to stop there. So that's one way you can kind of ensure that if someone is going to go through the tunnel, you'll have those 2 rounds of play to, come visit them.
I think that's really good because even though the tunnels are not in the absolute center of the board, because they're adjacent to all other tunnels, there's some of the best positioning spots on the board to control. And I think that's really good what you said about forcing opponent. I mean, they may send home a worker, but you've essentially forced an opponent to stop on a tunnel, like you said. I want to mention one thing that I have been thinking about as we've been talking about this, about doing this tutorial, is the ability to sort of double dip disarm. And that is, once you've unlocked the disarm mech, if you have these mechs on tunnels and you get attacked, the aggressor loses 2 power for attacking you. Then if you get sent home to base, 1 movement gets you back to the tunnel, and they lose.
It's incredibly powerful.
So you can essentially force your opponent to not only lose 2 power and what they spend on the combat, but then 2 more power and what they spend on another combat. And that's a lot of power.
I mean, it's got a huge impact on the state of the game when it comes to combats and the mental game behind that. Disarm is very effective, and for that reason, it's almost always the 3rd mech you take. You have to have speed and underpass to be here in the first place, so those are mandatory, but Disarm is just so powerful. It really is on the level of like Scout in some scenarios, where it's so oppressive that your opponents, like, they have to choose to not interact with you, or else they'll lose.
I want to mention one tactic that I like to use and that I've used a good bit that I know you're probably not as big of a fan as I am because you're a big believer in this first encounter. But I do want to point out there's always the option for people who want to move the character one space onto this mountain instead of all the way to the encounter. Then do what you said and move the mech and the 3 workers out to the tunnel. Move the mech and let's not move the character here.
Right. Instead of teleporting to this encounter, you would like to go over here and visit the factory. Yeah, so that's another creative
drop
useful.
There, suddenly you can go one move from this mountain to this mountain, and then your second move goes straight to the factory. You can get some match. You can get to the factory as early as turn 6.
Right.
Like the industrial innovative mats specifically, which can be really strong in games where you're a little bit outmatched, because a factory card late game is really helpful to Saxony, right? Because once you run out of if you're not really going for bottom row actions and you're just going mechs, workers, objectives, and combats, once you have your mechs and your workers, you're out of what are effectively bottom row actions, and you really just want to move every turn, right?
And it's going to be, you always have to weigh the opportunity cost of things like this, but again, whatever fits your win condition is going to be the right move, and underpass just opens you to so many options. It can be, exhausting sometimes, but if getting the factory card first or early is part of that win condition, this is absolutely a play I would do. And yes, having the ability to move every turn can just be such a good impact, such a high value impact mid and late game too.
One of the
definitely depends on matchups, but go ahead.
One of the things you said at one point to me kind of changed the way I thought about Saxony. And it's kind of an obvious point, but I hadn't really thought about it this way before. You can get as many stars as you want, as many stars as you can win combats as Saxony. Your opponents can only get 2. That's kind of an obvious point. It's a restatement of the rules. But what it means is you can just attack repeatedly, and after your opponents get 2 stars, there's really no upside for them winning. So you can effectively drain your opponents of combat, of power and cards to set up cheap and easy combats, which means with Saxony, you start with 1 power that you often have to use to get from 5 workers to 8, and 4 cards. And it makes it possible with Saxony. I mean, I've had games where I won 3 combats with 4 cards, which is crazy to think that it can happen. So I want to talk about when you're repeatedly attacking people, what do you think about, what are the thoughts that sort of go into whether you decide to bluff, whether you decide to trick someone and not bluff when they're expecting it? And I think it's helpful for players to think in terms of sort of what's the significance of individual numbers. Like what numbers of power and what numbers of total power from cards and power would you throw in different situations? What are the sort of the numbers you like too? And that's kind of a broad, a lot there, but kind of unpack that for us if you can.
Right, so this is going to be probably the most difficult skill in the game of Scythe to improve, to master, I'd say, but the game theory that goes into combats is a huge part of the game. First, if you go up here to the track, what stars do you need? Like, what stars are mandatory for you? If you don't have 2 objectives, then you maybe are looking at trying to get 3 combats. If you don't have any objectives, like maybe you're forced to do more bottom row actions, or maybe you need 4 combats. But hopefully that's not the case, because that's pretty difficult. When you're Saxony, what is a must-win fight and what is not? You have to understand that concept before you even initiate one. Because if we go back down here to the power track, you always want to be aware of the cost of a fight. So if you only have 1 power, if your opponent has 7 or more, let's say, if you have 1 power and you do a one-on-one fight, the most they would have to spend is 7. And the reason I say that is because I could throw a 5 and my power to have a total of 6. To win that fight, the defender has to throw 7. Right? So that could look like any combination of power and cards, but that's the tax that you're throwing at them when you initiate a fight. Now, if you did that same exact fight, but you had 3 power, the bar is higher. If you have 5 power, the bar is higher. So the cost of defending goes up and up and up the more you enter the fight with. So if you have a decent amount of power, let's say you have 5, right? Like you can throw 10. It means your opponent would have to spend 11. That's a lot. You have 5, and you spend all of it as the underdog, and they spend none, or let's say they go all out and they defend. What scenario are you in now? Now the bar is a 5, right? You're gonna go fight somebody with 0 power. The most you can spend is a card, right? That is so much worse a position to be in, especially if you were not even capable of guaranteeing the win. So any combat in which you are not the underdog, you have equal to or greater than their power. I guess it would help if I pulled another token out here, but let's just say your opponent was below you in power. They're not capable of hitting that 10, right? And now it's on you. Like, are you going to spend 8? Because that's their maximum, 5 plus 3. If you're in this position, you really only need to hit that max if it's a must-win fight. If it's not a must-win fight, or you need so much more than just the one victory, you still throw low. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you have to understand, like, what is the end game scenario I need to create for victory, and how is this combat going to get me there? Because if you need 3 stars and you do this on your first fight, you're not going to get 2 more stars like that. It's just not going to happen. So you have to be very tactful about what cards you throw, how much power you spend, and often your opponent gets wise to this, right? So, like, if your opponent threw the maximum every single time they got in a fight, what would happen? They would go to 0 power, they would run low on cards, and then you would get fights for extremely cheap. Like, you would get victories by spending just cards if you wanted. That's not a winning equation, right? Unless you're already in the late game. So back up to the top here, it's okay to hand out some combat stars in the first 7 to 9 turns of the game. That's fine, because these stars over here, they're not on the table yet. No one's done their mech star, their enlist star, their worker stars. They're still working on them. So if you're bringing combats into the equation before those bottom row actions are done, it's okay to load up your opponent with some early stars, because, like you said, what's their motivation now to spend cards and to spend power when they have 2 out of their 2 combat victories, right? Almost 0. Like, they don't want to spend, they don't want to get in more fights. They already have those. They want to do other things.
Yeah, I think,
but you can keep pressing the issue because you get as many stars as you want.
I would add to that 2 thoughts that I try to think about when I'm engaging in combat with Saxony. That is looking for places on the board that are high stakes, where your opponent loses a lot if they don't throw a lot. And an example I'd give is in a recent game I was in. It was actually kind of an embarrassing game. I was on a good Polania combination and got beat with a bad Saxony combination. The Saxony player got to the factory before me and drew that overpowered factory card for Saxony, which gives you a mech for 1 popularity. And they had set themselves up on this tunnel, and they immediately deployed Riverwalk and came down and attacked me on my village with 1 mech. So I was there with my character and a mech. Now, I knew they were probably going to bluff, but the cost of being wrong was so high that I felt like I had to throw enough to guarantee the victory anyway. And of course, they threw a 2. So it was a really effective way to drain me, because, you know, they knew they were going to bluff. I knew they were going to bluff. But that made it dangerous, because what if they said he's going to throw low because he knows I'm going to bluff? And if I take this risk and he loses the fight, his game is over.
Right.
That was a very high stakes fight. So I'd say look for places on the board where if you win the fight, the game is very hard to recover for your opponent, because you might find your opponent is willing to throw down a lot, even if they're an experienced player and expect you to bluff. And another thing I've done before is when I've been attacked, say on the factory or another significant spot, I look at how many cards the other faction has. If I get attacked with 2 units from Nordic on the factory and they have 2 cards, do I really think they're going to throw both of them when I can just counterattack them? No, they're going to bluff me. So I'd say keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what the opponent's going to do, try to create situations where the combats are high stakes. That can mean it's an important position on the board. That can mean it's very hard to recover from, like Polania getting sent back to the home base early. It can also look like a place where there are a bunch of workers and obviously potentially resources. You don't have to win those fights. Maybe you just have to force your opponent to say, I can't take the chance. The second point I want to make is I think that players, as they go along, start to think in these terms, but it's not immediately obvious. And that is with Saxony or any other faction, occasionally you've got to think of risk taking as, and I struggle a little bit to put this into words. Sometimes people think, I don't want to take this risk in combat or otherwise, because if it doesn't pan out, I lose. But you can't just think in those terms. You've got to think, if I don't take the risk, am I going to lose? So sometimes with Saxony combats, I was in a game not too long ago where I had a mech on this wood tunnel and Nordic was on the factory, right? I just had a 3 card and about as much power as Nordic did. So I couldn't begin to ensure that I would win the fight, but I knew that if I didn't attack them and everything went one more turn, I probably wouldn't win the game. So I took what may have been a low probability risk to fight on the factory, because I knew if I didn't take the risk, I was probably going to lose anyway, and it panned out. Sometimes risk taking has to be thought of, I would say has to be thought of in terms of, it's a gamble. I like to engage in fights I like to end the game with fights I can ensure that I'll win, but sometimes if I don't take that risk, I'm not going to win anyway. And I don't think players start off thinking in those terms. You talk about game theory. I think that's one of those game theory points you've got to think of.
And the way, if I was to give like just some general tips on how to start to get better at this process, because it's extremely complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into these decisions, and just the amount of different choices you could make with a single move are staggering. So to try to boil it down to some general tips for stuff like this.
It's why bots are terrible at this game, right? There are just so many options every turn. It's far more options than chess. Something like chess, you might have 20 different move options that a computer can easily calculate. Scythe has a lot more combinations.
And from a computer, from a bot standpoint, we're not there. And that's okay. We don't need those. We have humans. We want to try to think about this. What are the stakes for the opponent in this combat if I choose to initiate it? Like you said, some are must-win combats. If specifically you're in someone's home territory. A great example of this is up here. You have Nordics starting Iron Tile. They almost always need that space to be successful. If they don't have it, they probably don't have any mechs. And if they don't have any mechs, that means no factory. That means no middle of the board presence. That means probably no late game impact, right? So if you were to fight them on this space in the early game and they don't have Seaworthy, what happens if they lose, right? That's high stakes. So they're probably going to throw their only combat card and all of their power, or as much as it takes to win.
And one of the reasons
Having
it's so high stakes is it's kind of like Polani. Nordic has no good way to get out of their base except passing through this spot. And it's a whole move to get back to it. And then it's another move to get out. So you send Nordic to this home base and you slowed their game down immensely.
Yeah, but let's just think about that, right? Like, they have 4 power and 1 card, usually. You have 1 power and 4 cards, so it's the reverse. What should you do, right? You attack them. Let's say you brought 2 units. What do you do here? Well, ask yourself these questions. What happens if they lose, right? And then also, would I win the game? Would I be in a winning position? Could I end the game as the winner shortly after if I spend everything, right? So what's the situation are you in if you win? Because if you spend it all, but you still need 4 more stars, like that's not a good scenario necessarily for you to be in, right? So it's not worth the victory if the cost is high. Now, back to this. What should you spend, right? They have a single card and a lot of power compared to you. If they win this fight, and imagine you opened with that factory gambit, right? This is like the best case scenario for you. If they win this fight, they probably will have no cards left. And they maybe don't have 4 power anymore. They probably spent at least 1 power, right? So your mechs go home, and in the scenario they won, you could revisit them and pick up a star for far less investment, right? I can spend a single card and no power and probably win that fight, right? I would only need to throw somewhere between 0 and 4 with cards and power combined. So if you're going to think about how much is appropriate for you to spend, like, I would rather lose this and spend low or medium than spend a lot and win it. But there are scenarios where you absolutely should not take fights because your opponent is in a position where even if they spend a lot, they can recover quickly. And the example of this scenario would be you're fighting Nordic Patriotic. You come in here and they have some metal. They absolutely must win that fight. If they lose it, not only do they go home without their seaworthy mech, but you take some metal from them, right? Imagine they just produced. So huge turn. You usually don't take this fight because you're the underdog, right? They have more power than you. They can spend it all to ensure the victory. So even in a scenario where you have 2 mechs here, and let's say you had incredible luck, you have 2 5s, right? That just puts your maximum at 11. So while it's unlikely that that's the scenario, Nordic could still throw down and defend. Like, let's say you have a 5 and a 4, right? That would make it possible. Or maybe I'm not doing the math exactly right now, but they can spend quite a large number, and it's better for you to not even take this fight in the first place, because when they do defend, let's say they're capable of defending, they're going to bolster. They're going to get their power back, and they're going to put a mech down.
Right.
And
very next turn.
The bar goes back up. So even though you drained them, it's like it never happened, except they have a star now. So sometimes you don't want to take certain positions, but other times it's very advantageous. The things I look for to know what positions, when I need to take combats, are like if someone just moved or if someone just produced. That's usually when the stakes are high. Because if you just moved, you typically just put workers down intentionally because you want to produce with them. So let's say you just moved out to the board and you put 3 workers on this village with some mechs or whatever. Or you put 4 workers on the farm or some on the forest. Like, wherever you are, you're probably going to produce next. That's very common. If I were to send you home before your production turn, you're not looking good. Like, you just wasted a move action, and now you can't produce, which is the whole point of moving in the first place. Like, that's high stakes. Or if you just finished producing, but you weren't able to use the resources. So on most boards, you have a produce to a bottom row action that's good, but sometimes you need to produce resources that you will use later, like during the move action. So an example, right? On the industrial board right now, if I produce lumber, I don't get to spend it right away, but it's still good for me to do because when I move, I can spend it.
Yeah.
If someone just produced their moving resource, you want to go take it as long as you know it's difficult for them to come back. Those create high cost scenarios for them, and that's where you're going to find people spending a lot. So the meta becomes spending low to medium just to keep them honest until the bar is low enough for you to collect all those combat stars on the table. But as you add more players and you add fast combinations, like this becomes incredibly difficult because, yes, sometimes handing out combat stars loses you the game, and it's not okay to do. But most times you can be fast enough and bring enough firepower with you to make it okay.
Yeah. One of the things, you used the word tax earlier, and I think that's a really good word to describe a particular strategy with Saxony. I think players, as they play Saxony, get to a point where, you know, they either go all out and ensure the victory, or they throw like a 2 to just outright bluff. And they may even start to throw medium amounts with the idea that they could trick somebody. I like to think of an additional thing when I'm deciding what to throw, and I think Nordic's a great example because Nordic starts with 4 power and 1 card. If I throw a 4 card, maybe I bring 2 units just to kind of trick them, and I throw a 4 card. And this space is really high stakes for Nordic now because maybe they don't even have a mech on there. Maybe there's some metal and just workers. So if they get sent back home, not only do they lose their metal, but they have no way to bring those workers back to the metal tile. Maybe I throw a 4 card because I know that Nordic with 4 power and 1 card cannot win the fight unless they throw their 1 combat card. And even if they win and bolster the next turn, they're sitting on a maximum of 7 power. And then I can come back and hit them again and know that they have no cards. So sometimes I try to think of combat with Saxony not in terms of whether I'll get a star or how much power I'm giving up, but you use the phrase keep them honest. I think of what I'm doing to their power and combat supply. They have to, I mean, if they throw low and I win the combat, and it's great, you know, bonus. Sometimes I come into it thinking not so much what do I want to happen here, is say I don't win the combat, what do I want them to spend? And I think that's really helpful to think in those terms when you throw a medium amount. Maybe I throw 5 total and I lose, and I think, oh gosh, I wish I'd thrown 1. But you don't think in those terms because game theory says, you know, if it was a good decision at the time you made it, it's a good decision even if it doesn't turn out well. From a game theory perspective, I think, you know, what do I want them to lose? And if it's Nordic early in the game where they're not set up to enlist yet, I want them to lose their first card. Because if someone goes to 0 cards, suddenly every single turn I know exactly what I have to play to win.
Yep. And you have much more information at that point.
And that makes combat so much cheaper to not have to guess what combat cards are. So throwing 4 in, throwing 3 means if they go all out in power, they win, and then they're still sitting on a card, and I don't know if it's a 2 or a 5, but throwing 1 more power, throwing 4, can either win and send them back to home base in a devastating manner, or force them to spend that 1 card and put them in a 0 card situation. So I think that's something that players don't always think about early on that can be really powerful. Is there, before we get into the mats, is there anything else you wanted to talk about or think we should talk about as far as combat or anything else?
Yeah, I think we have to mention like the impact that Disarm has on fights because it's counterintuitive sometimes at first. So you fought on a tunnel. What happens? If you're the attacker, the opponent loses 2 power right away. Let's say your opponent has moderate amount of power. They have 6, okay? Now the combat begins. They're at 4 power because of Disarm. What's going to happen next, right? Well, you might think that they're intimidated, you brought a couple units, like you use Disarm on them. They probably won't throw very much because you're intimidating, you're Saxony, look at this. they're probably going to throw all of their power. And if they don't, they probably should, because what happens if they don't, right? If they throw medium, let's say they spend some expensive cards, but they hold on to their power, and you lose. You go home, but in the very next fight, the first thing that happens is that they lose 2 more power. So that's 4 power that were just wasted over 2 combats, right? So the best thing to do from their perspective is honestly to spend all the power so that they can't get disarmed anymore. And that's what you want, right? So as Saxony, with Disarm, know that you're typically going to drain the opponent's of their power through the effect itself, but also they need to spend it so they don't lose it, right? Like if they hold on to it, it's wasted on future attacks, especially if you're at 7 or less power.
And a few things Disarm can do too that I want to throw out there is, one, your opponent is getting close to the power star, you can create more distance between them and the power star, whether you win the combat or not, which can be really clutch in some games. And the second thing I would say is it's important to keep in mind that the attacker's mech ability goes first and the defender's mech ability goes second. 2 examples I would give of when this matters is if you're attacking Nordic on a tunnel and they have artillery and they have 2 power. Well, if you disarm them or they use artillery, which is what happens if you attack, they lose their power and then they can't artillery because artillery costs the power. The flip side of Disarm going first is if you attack Albion, say Albion or Tagawa that has Shield or Ronin respectively on a tunnel, well, you can disarm them down to 0 power or 2 less power, but then Shield or Ronin is going to give them that power right back. So keep in mind, always keep in mind that the attacker ability goes first, which sometimes is your friend and sometimes your enemy. If I was attacking Albion at 0 power, I would love for them to get shield and then to disarm them, but that's not how it works.
Right.
Whereas it's great for it to go first with artillery because you may take away their ability to artillery altogether.
Yeah, it doesn't always have an impact, but it does. The order of operations there can be significant. But back to like Disarm's impact on the game is kind of like Scout, right? Like if you get attacked by Crimea and you're going to lose a card and you know there will be more fights, like you probably want to spend your best cards before they get taken. And that's kind of similar here. Like you do want to spend your power before it gets drained, because what is 2 power through Disarm value to you? It's nothing. It's just gone. You would rather get a combat star. I know we focused a lot on combats, but you always want to frame them right in your game plan. So that's going to be back to the stars you need. And sometimes, like if we look at my situation here, right, I'm industrial. I have 2 pretty solid objectives. Maybe I can do both of them, maybe not. But their population advantage, which is a territory-based one, that's one of the best ones to do. And then get rich, which maybe is difficult, but maybe not. It's going to depend on some encounters factors there. But usually, you only want to create the bare minimum amount of like combat interactions to get the number of stars you're looking for, whether that's 2, 3, 1, whatever. It does, like, it's not always in your best interest to keep fighting and fighting and fighting all over again, because that backfires pretty hard when you're not in the winning position. So if you're not in first place and you are fighting a lot, people can flip it on you, and it can be a double-edged sword here. Like, hey, do you want to go to 6 stars and not get first? No, of course you don't. But with Dominate, you don't have a choice. You're forced to lose fights at that point because of overshooting and playing too aggressive. So the answer isn't always, bring the fight to the opponent and, lose on purpose or whatever. Like, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is, create some win-win scenarios for yourself. If my opponent spends to win this, I'm in a good position because I can come back before they're able to escape, for example. Or, like, if my opponent doesn't throw and I do win, the game's over, kind of. Like that's a high cost scenario too. Now, a lot of the like, I can come back to make sure I capitalize on like the draining of my opponent idea doesn't mean you have to have a factory card, right? So typically you won't have a factory card in the early game, because that's something that usually happens after turn 10 or so. Like more often than not, you can't move every turn. So what does it look like to guarantee or to pick fights that are good for you without a factory card? That's all about worker placement, right? Getting 5 to 8 workers fast so you can slow people down, right? You want to put workers in places where they have to stop their movement if they want to go through those places. Typically those places are piles you can reach. So again, if you're at home, you go from this one to any tunnel, or if you're on any iron space on the board, like that one for example, any tunnel is fair game. If you fight somebody, make sure you think about where they would move next if they win, and what you can do to make sure they get stuck at places you can reach. That's like a huge, it's going to be a huge factor into which fights you should take, because it's a bad idea to like go all the way up here, for example, and lose. Because how are you supposed to get back there in a meaningful amount of time? It's just not going to happen. Right? So if you fought Albion and you're more than one space away from a tunnel, maybe this is a bad idea. More often than not, you lock the tunnels down, and if people aren't going to approach you or get close enough, that's okay, because you have the entire board and you can continue doing things like visit the factory or get a mech star or do other important actions while they slowly move out in a defensive ball, because that's typically the response to aggression, is to pile mechs up and go slow. But that's also good for you, because then you have a monopoly on these important spaces, and the spaces I'm talking about here are like everything inside the tunnel ring. So that's like 2 points per hex, and you get to control future movements by clogging them up with workers. I think I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but always evaluate like not only the cost of a fight from both perspectives, but the impact it would have on the game, right? So it's late game. This is, high stakes for everybody. And then how easily it is for you to return to a combat with that player.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to make one last sort of point here before we get into the mats themselves, and that is one thing that traps newer players or even intermediate players who may have been playing Saxony for a while is I would call it the 5-star trap. And that is, with Saxony, never go to 5 stars if you're not winning, because suddenly people can attack you and force you to choose between giving them a combat, which may give them a 6-star, or just losing position on the board. I've been in games with Saxony where I went to 5 stars and suddenly these tunnels mean nothing, because I can disarm them when I can attack, but since if I win the combat, they win the game, I keep having to throw 0. And they can just repeatedly attack me and send all my stuff home. And suddenly these tunnels are no longer my best friend, because to go back out on them, I have to win a combat and lose the game. So I'm just stuck in my home base. And with Saxony, you don't with a lot of factions, if they go ahead and get both of their combat stars, they can go to 5 stars because no one can hit them and give them a 6-star because they have their 2 combats. If you're at 5 stars with Saxony, or even 4 stars with Saxony, even if you've gotten 2 combats already, they can keep giving you combats and end the game. So watch out for getting to 5 stars as Saxony. Also be mindful that even if you're at 4 stars, if they attack you at 3 different places and they only need 1 combat to end the game themselves, well, you've just lost the game if you're not winning. So I think that's another point to make as Saxony before we go into the mats, is always be cognizant of how many stars you have, because dominate can be your best friend, But late game, if you're not careful, it can lose you the game.
Yep. Definitely has a tragic downside to it, but overall, very powerful faction ability.